my name is Langdon Winburn, and I will be doing the introduction episode for our podcast series. Have you ever really thought about what is in your food and how it impacts your overall health? The only way to really understand what happens to your body and to your health after consuming something is by breaking it down ingredient by ingredient, and that's all the crave right now in our society. However, what if a key ingredient in almost everything is something that a large majority of our population have a negative misconception around? What if consumers solely base their decisions on the opinions of others without actually researching and seeking out the truth for themselves? And as a matter of fact, most consumers don't even really know what the 3-letter abbreviation stands for that we will be talking about throughout this podcast. How does this largely affect consumers and producers, and what really is the truth? The secret ingredient that I am discussing is GMOs and the usage of those into our food. GMO stands for genetically modified organisms, and hearing that for the first time may sound a little bit scary, but once you understand the process, this isn't a scary concept at all. Farmers and producers have been using and incorporating genetically modified organisms into our food since the beginning of time in many different ways. To be considered a genetically modified organism, the process goes something like this. The producer takes the good parts of plant A and combines it with the good parts of plant B to make the optimal plant C. It's as simple as that. Plant breeding, which is the process I just broke down, has been done for centuries because humans want to consume the absolute possible best, and there's nothing wrong with that. We have used genetically modified organisms to improve a large variety of products such as corn, rice, bananas, beans, and the list could go on forever because of the scale GMOs operate on. Also think about all the different products those plants are then put towards making. As you can see, GMOs play a very large role in our society. Currently, however, we do face a problem, and that is that we have a lot more people to feed, but on a lot less land to do so. Think back to your own hometown, and a large portion of you can probably count the large-scale farming operations on one hand, if you even have any. So that's one example of why the usage of GMOs can really play a positive role, because producers are able to grow more but on less land, and still have the solid quality needed for nutrition. The expected population of the world is supposed to be around 9 billion people by 2050, and that's a lot of mouths to feed. The usage of genetically modified organisms isn't just a necessity currently. This is something that will play a very large role for the future of the world as a whole, and yes, I said the whole world, and the way that we as humans are able to survive and thrive. But if people think genetically modified organisms are so bad, how are agriculturalists supposed to supply everything that is needed for human consumption? Do you see the problem? With all of this being said, our group had one common question and concern. What are the implications from the misconceptions surrounding GMOs and the actual truth behind the matter? Throughout this podcast, our group will be discussing different aspects around this topic, ranging from how the misconceptions of genetically modified organisms affect farmers and producers, how health food movements and anti-GMO movements are affected by public perception, the role that scientists and nutritionists play, and the overall consumer opinions that we face. Everyone should be aware of what they are consuming and if it will affect you. And it's important as young adults that we begin making the most healthy choices for our future and our current lifestyle. So stay tuned to learn some more on the actual facts behind this current crave in our society, and hopefully you can begin implementing this knowledge into your everyday lives.
This podcast will feature clips from an interview. Here's Averie to introduce our interviewee.
Connor Richardson is a Kentucky FFA state officer. Following elections, FFA state officers are required to go through training courses on the agriculture industry through organizations such as the Kentucky Farm Bureau, the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, and the National FFA Association.
Hello, I'm Lindsey Osbourne, and this episode is about how the misconceptions and lies about GMOs affect farmers. Today, I'm going to discuss how misconceptions of GMOs affect society. My main focus will be on how these affect farmers specifically. These lies that GMOs are detrimental to our health are hurting numerous people, but they are mainly hurting GMO farmers. As people are no longer purchasing GMO crops, GMO farmers are starting to go out of business. According to Ken Kamiya, who is a Hawaiian farmer, without GMO technology, there would be no papaya business, and farmers would be out of farming. In an article on U.S. News, Ken explains in great detail the benefits of GMO technology. Without this GMO technology, producing and harvesting crops would be much more time-consuming and require a lot more effort out in the fields. For example, an Illinois GMO farmer, Katie Pratt, mentions that GMO crops have greatly reduced the amount of pesticide that needs to be sprayed. This seems like something small, but this is actually a huge deal. This has allowed families to spend more quality time together. Instead of working in the fields from sunrise to sunset spraying pesticides, families can actually eat dinner all together and relax in the evenings, thanks to GMO crops. Quality time is something we often take for granted unless you are a farmer that does not grow GMO crops and does not have this opportunity. This also now applies to GMO farmers that are going out of business. These are just a few examples of how farmers are greatly affected by the lies that say GMO crops are dangerous for the public's consumption. These lies are causing farmers to go out of business, which negatively affects the society as a whole. For instance, this will cause the society to have less access to food. This will cause the population growth to decline as individuals are not getting proper nutrition. The unemployment rate will begin to rise as farmers go out of business. They obviously can't afford to pay others to work for them since they aren't getting paid much themselves. Like I mentioned earlier, this affects way more than just farmers themselves. This affects farmers' families. GMO farmers that go out of business are no longer able to financially support their family. Not just financially, but also emotionally. They have to deal with all the stress and all of the pressure, wondering how they are going to put food on the dinner table for their families. Not only will GMO farmers suffer from these lies and misconceptions, but also farmers markets that sell GMO crops. These rumors that are spreading like a wildfire are affecting the United States economically. There are many people that rely and depend on the income from farmers markets to make a living. If the public is no longer purchasing GMO crops from farmers markets, many consequences will come about. These lies are truly tearing up lives. If these misconceptions and lies were avoidable, farmers would be way more successful and would not have to suffer from so much stress. I honestly don't think that the public is aware of how much farmers are affected when they make the decision to not purchase GMO crops. If we can bring about light and truth about GMOs, farmers would not have to suffer as much, and families would not be struggling. My name is Rachel Crick, and my episode will focus on anti-GMO groups and organizations. Next time you go to the grocery store, look on the back of the first packaged food you find. There might be labels attesting to the health and safety of the product, such as the USD Organic seal, an allergen-free label, and maybe right next to that there will be a little orange butterfly with a check mark. This is the label representing a product that is non-GMO Project verified. The Non-GMO Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to labeling non-GMO foods and promoting consumer awareness of GMOs. They claim to be champions for consumer choice.
Their website puts their beliefs in plain view, saying, "Preserving and building the non-GMO supply chain is a critical step of transitioning towards a safe, healthy food supply for future generations." This is one of the many anti-GMO organizations, but it seems to be the most popular currently, so we'll use it as an example. So how are companies like this affected by public attitudes about GMOs formerly discussed? If the public is suspicious of the safety of GMOs, they will turn to organizations like these. They will purchase products labeled with the non-GMO seal. This means that it's highly beneficial for these companies if the public continues to have a negative idea of GMOs. The Non-GMO Project is technically considered non-profit, but it does cost money for companies to get their products verified by it. That's not unusual, since nonprofits do have expenses. However, if every company decides to jump on the non-GMO labeling bandwagon, this could mean an influx of money to the non-GMO advocacy groups. And what's the reason companies should pay large sums of money to have their products verified? According to the Non-GMO Project's website, Non-GMO Project Verified is the fastest-growing label in the natural products industry, representing $22.3 billion in annual sales and more than 50,000 verified products for over 3,000 brands. Non-GMO products are in demand, and the Non-GMO Project Verified seal is the most trusted non-GMO label among consumers. So in other words, the producers should do it because it's in vogue and customers will buy it. It's a two-way street, however. These companies affect the rhetoric surrounding the issues as well. By placing the non-GMO labels next to other healthy labels, it gives the consumer the idea that GMOs aren't healthy and reinforces their negative beliefs about them. It is also confusing and contributes to misinformation about what food items actually are genetically modified. The more products are labeled with the Non-GMO Project Verified sticker, the more people will fear GMOs, despite not knowing very much about them. The Non-GMO Project benefits from consumer fear and contributes to this fear and the suspicion surrounding GMOs. They encourage companies to jump on the non-GMO bandwagon and makes it harder for sellers who don't label their foods non-GMO to sell their products. In short, the Non-GMO Project and other anti-GMO organizations and movements benefit from consumers distrusting GMOs. This creates a demand for labeled foods and encourages producers to contribute to the confusion by getting their products verified. This costs a fee, so that money goes right back into the Non-GMO Project and similar organizations, funding their quest for a non-GMO world. Here's what Connor Richardson had to say on the matter.
When you walk into a store that has two products sitting next to each other, and one says that it has GMOs or just doesn't say non-GMO, and then one product says non-GMO, you suddenly start to think and get people's wheels turning. And so this marketing has made people feel like that they should pay more for something that says non-GMO just simply because it says non-GMO.
My name is Joseph Loconzolo, and today I'll be talking about how misconceptions about GMOs affect scientists. Scientists have put in numerous hours studying and working with GMOs to improve some foods' overall nutritional value, as well as decrease the environmental impact producing that food has on the environment. To their dismay, much of their work is met with a wave of emotions backed by common misconceptions that are fueled by confirmation bias, making their work go unappreciated and harder for them to work with GMOs in the future. As my group members previously talked about, there are a great number of misconceptions about GMOs, whether it's about how safe they are to ingest or even what they are. There's still a good portion of the United States population, as well as the rest of the world, that seem to be against GMOs regardless of the scientific evidence presented before them, as most people feel strongly about what goes into their food.
So I actually did a survey last semester about GMOs, and I got all kinds of responses saying that GMOs cause cancer and GMOs are cause all kinds of diseases, and GMOs are just going to ruin us and cause us to be so sick and everything else. And I think that That just absolutely amazes me because there's no science that backs any of that up, and there have been no links found between the use of genetic modification and any kind of disease or anything like that. I mean,
Confirmation bias is described in an interview between Alexander Osella and the award-winning documentary director Scott Hamilton Kennedy. Kennedy, who just recently finished directing Food Evolution, a film that investigates the truth of GMOs using science, says, quote, "Confirmation bias is when a scientist only sees evidence that supports their hypothesis. The bad scientist will say, I want to say that GMOs are bad, and they'll look for evidence that will find GMOs are bad. The good scientist will say, I want to know what GMOs are. Are they unhealthy? The reason that scientists and people buy into confirmation bias is because we are constantly looking for things that support our way of life. This idea of confirmation bias is a large reason why misconceptions about GMOs are becoming so much more widespread. For example, many people argue that GMOs are less healthy than organic foods. People that might hear this might believe it right away, or do their own research. However, this research is generally one-sided, as people will search for evidence confirming that GMOs are less healthy, failing to even consider the scientific evidence disputing the misconception. The result is scientists have more trouble releasing new reports and data about the benefits of GMOs when they face such opposition from the public. This is especially worse on scientists that are early in their career and have not yet established themselves. A newer scientist is less likely to pursue something that will not receive the best response. In an article by Julia Bullis, Brad Pulmer, and Ryan Resnick, 270 scientists were surveyed about the main problems facing them today. The results showed that, quote, they are forced to prioritize self-preservation over pursuing the best questions and uncovering meaningful truths, end quote. There are still a lot of common misconceptions about GMOs, which is a problem because the more common a belief is, the harder it is to pursue studies that will allow GMOs to benefit the world even more. The effect of this is shown in an article by NPR. In the NPR article, GMO potatoes have arrived, will anyone buy them? Dan Charles writes about how scientists were recently able to genetically engineer potatoes to not bruise as easily. Now this is a good thing. This will decrease the amount of potatoes wasted, making more potatoes available to the public, and decreasing the chemicals applied to potatoes. However, Charles also notes that even before the potatoes undergo tests by the FDA to determine their safety rating, some of the biggest potato buyers in the country, such as Frito-Lay and McDonald's, seem afraid to touch these potatoes. An executive at another potato chip company told The Salt that his company does not plan to use these potatoes. He didn't even want to be quoted on the subject for fear that someone would mistakenly get the opposite impression, end quote. Charles highlights very clearly the difficulty scientists face by working with GMOs, and how companies do not want to be associated with GMOs because they have to make their consumers happy. If a company goes against the beliefs of the consumers on GMOs backed by misconceptions, then the consumer will no longer support this company. To avoid this, companies do not support the scientists that work on GMOs, as noted by Charles in this article. Thus, the scientists working in this field are forced to choose self-preservation by not choosing to work with GMOs in the future. Misconceptions about GMOs have a significant effect on the scientists in their work with GMOs to benefit consumer health and decrease the environmental impact. These misconceptions back consumer beliefs and are fueled by confirmation bias, making it very difficult for scientists to work with GMOs and take advantage of the full potential GMOs have.
My name is Averie Levanti, and this episode examines consumer impact in the genetically modified food industry. If you're listening to this podcast, you are more than likely to be a consumer of genetically modified organisms. Whether your opinion falls on the side favoring or not favoring genetically modified organisms, if you go to the grocery store to purchase food, you are a consumer in the genetically modified organism market. Whether you buy genetically modified food or try to purposely avoid it, you are having some sort of impact on the industry. Consumers are arguably the most important of our genetically modified organism stakeholders, considering many of the others are affected, either positively or negatively, as a result of consumer impact in the market. Everything comes back to the people who are buying the food. Unfortunately, a lack of education leads many consumers to take a negative approach, often fueled by preconceived misconceptions, to the subject of genetically modified foods. The attitudes of consumers greatly impact the genetically modified food market, with other stakeholders feeling the ripple effect. So what exactly is our nation's attitude towards genetically modified foods? Mariana McCreary-Wolf, Juliana McDonald, Christine Domigan, and Heidi Yoon, members of the Agribusiness Department of California Polytechnic State University, conducted a study on consumer attitudes towards genetically modified food. Over 2 phases, 1,206 randomly selected food purchasers in San Luis Obispo County, California, were interviewed on their attitudes towards genetically modified foods. It is worth noting that the second phase of research was conducted following a recall of many food products containing maize that was grown using a genetically modified seed. Between Phase 1 and Phase 2, which were only conducted 9 months apart, 9.4% of respondents increased their organic food consumption. An average of 35.6% of people said that ingredient labels very often impact their purchase decision, while an average of 47.3% said that nutritional labels very often impact their purchase decision. Similarly, 81.2% of Phase 1 respondents said it was either somewhat or very important for the government to impose mandatory labeling of genetically modified foods. This number increased by 7.1% to 88.3% of respondents during Phase 2. In addition to this, during Phase 1, 43.6% of people said they were either somewhat or very familiar with genetically modified food, and this number increased by 6.8% to 50.4% overall during the second phase, which, note, followed the recall. Of those who said they were at least somewhat familiar, 66.3% said that newspaper and television news were the sources of their awareness. Only 16% said their awareness came as a result of employment in either farming or food processing. Similarly, respondents rated television news reporters and newspaper reporters as more appropriate sources than farmers on information concerning genetically modified food. If only 50% of people are at least somewhat familiar with the genetically modified foods, why do 88% believe the government should impose mandatory labeling for all genetically modified food? Aside from this, one of the most glaring statistics found in the survey was 2/3 of people putting their quote-unquote awareness behind what they see on television and what they read in the news, and even rated both television and newspaper reporters as more appropriate sources than farmers. As aforementioned, this study took place in San Luis Obispo County, California, which was chosen because it was found to be the best of 3,141 counties to represent a microcosm of the United States of America. These consumer attitudes are what send a ripple effect throughout the rest of the genetically modified food industry. People's opinions on what a genetically modified organism is or isn't can go a long way. Properly educating consumers on genetically modified organisms can be a step in the right direction in terms of dispelling many of the myths that weigh down the industry.
The reason that our group chose this topic was to discuss how the misconceptions around GMOs create negative stereotypes that affect the general public's perception, regardless of the actual truth behind the matter. Genetically modified organisms and the usage of those into our food is not unhealthy, and in order to provide for the growing population around the world, producers will have to incorporate GMOs into our food due to the excessive amount that we will need. The usage of GMOs helps with a lot of things, ranging from better taste and textures, growing more food on less land, and making sure that crops are more pest resistant to avoid harmful pesticides. We've been using GMOs since the beginning of time, and since they have not been proven to be harmful for human consumption, the argument around them being so terrible is entirely idiotic.
In this podcast, we have discussed how the misconceptions and lies about GMOs are hurting numerous people. In my episode, I specifically focus on how farmers are affected by these misconceptions. Like I mentioned earlier, farmers are starting to go out of business because the public believes GMOs are bad for you and are detrimental to your health. In my previous episode, I mentioned how these lies are tearing up our economy. Not only are farmers going out of business, but so are farmers markets. The unemployment rate is rapidly growing. Our access to food is becoming limited. The population growth is declining. All of these terrible things are happening because of the false rumors being spread about GMOs. We need to find a way, as a society, to find a solution to this problem before things get even worse. We can start by educating the public about GMOs.
Based on my research into anti-GMO groups and organizations, I have concluded that these organizations are completely aware of the lack of scientific evidence surrounding their desire for a non-GMO world. They do not cite specific research, and to convince producers to participate in the non-GMO project, they promise higher sales only. They're literally telling companies there's no other reason to do this except that it's currently trendy. This is just contributing to the problem of misinformation about GMOs, and they're all right with that. Consumer ignorance is profitable for anti-GMO organizations. Don't let them fool you. Do your own research, and don't just assume that because something has a little butterfly and a check mark that it's good for you.
Misconceptions about GMOs have a direct impact on scientists' ability to study GMOs. They make it harder for scientists to pursue studying the benefits of GMOs when they receive such negative reception from their work. This also slows down GMO research that could potentially benefit the rest of the world and improve the health benefits to overall foods.
Researching about consumer attitudes on genetically modified foods led us to the fact that many people are quick to judge genetically modified organisms even if they do not know much about them. Wolf, McDonald, Domigan, and Yount's study proved this to be true, with their statistics revealing that a staggering 88% of people want to see our government impose mandatory labeling of genetically modified foods. Considering only 50% of respondents were only somewhat familiar with what genetically modified organisms even are, the high percentage of those who want our food to be labeled is worrying. Labeling can lead even more people to believing that genetically modified organisms are bad for you. After all, why does it have to be pointed out if it isn't a problem? Things such as labeling are one of the reasons genetically modified organisms tend to have a bad rep, and this can have a negative impact on some of our other stakeholders, such as farmers. Do you think it's important to inform young people about GMOs, and why or why not?
I definitely think it's important to inform people about GMOs because a lot of people just go into the store and want to buy stuff that says non-GMO just because they have this perception that GMOs are bad. And so I think informing people about GMOs is so important because at least then they can make an informed decision. Because I think a lot of people don't realize that we only have genetically modified so many crops, and so they can go into the store and buy something that says non-GMO that there's not even a GMO variety, a genetically modified variety of that crop, but they're going to pay more just because it says non-GMO. So I think it's really important so that we have informed consumers and that people are able to make informed decisions and decide what they want based off of facts, not just based off of perception.
Thank you for listening to our podcast about GMOs. We hope that we set the record straight, and also that you're inspired to be a more informed consumer.